Well, look, the cost of living crisis is the big issue facing us all. And IBEC have referred to some businesses that are in trouble, and he says without support could go to the wall. And Tom and Nevin are talking about the need for targeted measures for those who are most adversely impacted by the cost of living crisis. And I think we should always refer to the cost of living and housing crisis, frankly, because the two crises are running directly parallel and are dire in both cases. But first of all, is it fair comment to say there are winners and losers in this situation? I'd like to hear your opinion on that. I mean, we just had IFAC and the SRI in, and among other things, they're reporting that corporate tax revenues, they projected, even I was stunned by it, and I'm aware about how profits have gone up in the corporate sector. They've trebled basically over the last decade. But I think it was IFAC were projecting corporate tax receipts for this year could be, I think he said 20 billion euro. So somebody's making money. Somebody's making money. It's not obviously your members who are saying we could go to the wall, but somebody is making money out of all of this. We certainly know the energy companies are making a lot of money at the moment, and there are some big corporations that are making a lot of money. I suspect the pharmaceutical industry is making a lot of money. I think some of the people involved in property speculation and so on, I think, have to be making a lot of money. So, you know, is it fair to say that there are some big winners out of all this, and then there are a lot of people who are losers? And how do we address that? Because if we just give handouts, I mean, I don't think we should be giving handouts to super profitable companies, for example, or to super wealthy people. They don't need it. They're actually potentially benefiting out of the current situation. But then equally, when we get onto the issue, to use the much used phrase of targeting support, which again, Tom and Nevin have referred to there, that where is the threshold? I mean, people are a little bit reluctant, and I asked IFAC this, where do we begin and end with targeting? Because sometimes at least it comes across as saying, well, we will help the absolute poorest, and we absolutely have to. It's vitally important that people who are already poor aren't further impoverished, or that more people are driven into poverty. But I think there's also a whole range of people, working people out there, who are taking a very severe hit. They may not quite be driven into poverty, but they're seriously struggling. And it is completely unjust if you take as a reasonable estimate that they could be down 3, 4, 5 grand in terms of the real value of their income. They need help. So where is the threshold for targeted measures? I'd just be interested to hear how you do that, because as policymakers, those are the decisions we have to make. And sometimes the economists are a little bit reluctant. They say, well, that's up to you guys. But I think those are the decisions we have to make. And in broad terms, should we be talking about redirecting from the winners, or redistributing from the winners to the people who are losing in all of this? Isn't that, in broad terms, the way you address the current crisis? If energy companies are making a super profits, that's through really nothing particular they've done, that some of those profits should be redirected into protecting those who are suffering as a result of this crisis, whether it's small business or whether it's working people or pensioners or whatever. So I'd just like to hear your comments on that.
I'm happy To take the winners and losers comments, Deputy, and to reflect on what we see across the business community. You're absolutely...
Sorry, can I ask one other question, just because I'll run out of time, and this is a very quick question. Is it the case that even before this crisis hit, that the cost of living here in a whole number of the areas that have been mentioned was much, much higher than the rest of Europe, for example, in childcare, in housing, in education, and in a number of other areas, pre-Ukraine, the current round of the cost of living crisis? And why is that the case? Why do we have higher childcare costs than everywhere else? Why do we have higher rents and house prices? Why do we have the highest education fees, anywhere? Just, I'd be interested just if you could throw that into the mix of questions as well. Sorry.
Yep.
Sorry for that.
Happy to comment on that as well, Deputy. Winners and losers in corporate tax and everything, what we see across the business space. You're absolutely right. We would agree with that. The IFEC estimate that we could well see corporate tax revenue hitting 20 billion this year. It's not that long since it was 4 or 5 billion. Reflects a couple of things. One, the engine of this economy with 2.5 million people at work is performing really, really strongly. And I think it gives us the resources now to have choices to help those who need support during this crisis. Most of what you see in the corporate tax revenue for this year, that is the rear view mirror though. That's the economy of last year. And many of those companies did probably do quite well during our COVID period, whether they were technology companies or whether they were medical and pharmaceutical and related companies. So some sectors of our economy did really, really well. And Ireland did well out of those sectors, doing well globally. Right now, there are very, very few winners in this economy. The winners are in a different part of the world. That is the reality of energy inflation. When it comes to our energy companies and the very, very small number of companies who will have some potential upside with the way energy markets are working at the moment, but clearly we're going to see an EU framework to address that in a coordinated way across the EU. I think that's the kind of sensible thing to do. We know from some of our members where they may be benefiting on one sector of their energy business, be it wind or whatever, then they've offset costs in other sectors where they actually haven't passed through the full economic cost and the full energy inflation cost that they've been facing. So I don't think we're actually going to get very large scale revenue from whatever this EU framework will be on the energy side. But the much bigger picture actually has been the strength of the corporate sector generally. But we will not have corporate winners in the Irish economy from what we're facing right now. That was from a different phase of the global economy. Even if we didn't have this terrible war in the Ukraine, we would have had inflationary problems because we created so much money in the global monetary system and from a fiscal policy perspective during COVID. We would have had inflation anyway. Do we have a high cost of living? We do have a high cost of living in Ireland, but we also have very high income levels. And we do have relatively high salaries compared to the rest of Europe that drive a cost of doing business, particularly in labour-intensive sectors. I think the challenge now is this accelerated cost of living that we need to be able to address. But from our perspective, we're not going to see winners in the business community from inflation. This is a tax on the entire economy that is predominantly coming from energy-producing nations, and Ireland is not going to benefit. Our businesses in Ireland are not going to benefit from the energy price surge that we're seeing come through globally.
Yeah, in terms of those winners and losers, I mean, Fergal's right. Obviously, the digital economy and pharma companies benefited enormously from the COVID crisis, at least in terms of their bottom line. And Ireland, as a European hub for many of those companies, likewise benefited in terms of corporation tax receipts. In terms of the energy sector, that's not a strength for the Irish economy. We import a lot of our energy, and I agree that the solution there in terms of windfall taxes or similar is probably best done at a European level. In terms of the cost of living, yes, the cost of living is very, very high. Ourselves in Denmark usually are at the very, very top of that list. We are high income, but we have very, very unequal market incomes, which is why our tax and welfare system has to work as hard as it does and should continue to work as hard as it does in terms of being redistributive. Why is housing so high? Well, I mean, the first order reason is that supply hasn't been able to match demand for 13 or 14 years now. And obviously a lot of the roots of that go back to the financial crash. There's a lack of workers in the sector, issues with financing. The state also stepped away from its responsibilities too. Yeah, but in terms of education, childcare, housing across the board, I mean, what we do in Ireland is our government revenue as a proportion of income is low, which means that we underfund a lot of these areas relative to other countries in Western Europe, and therefore their cost of living in terms of these type of expenses tends to be lower. So they have a much stronger set of universal public services or universal basic services. And one of the things that we've emphasised in terms of our opening statement and also our commentary generally has been that the budget should focus on reducing the cost of those services, which is a type of spending by government which would actually be disinflationary in terms of ultimately labour costs for businesses, but just generally in the economy overall. And we see that as a possible win area. So government effectively reducing its appropriations and aids, reducing the cost of education, reducing the cost of healthcare, reducing the cost of childcare in particular. All of those areas there is scope to boost real incomes effectively, or take-home incomes after all of their necessities, reducing the cost of business ultimately in the sense that there won't be less of a feed-through in terms of labour demands, but also being disinflationary and also dealing with fundamental problems in the economy. Obviously, the cost of childcare removes vast swathes of workers in their 30s and 40s from the labour force. Principally, those are the people with the very highest human capital, which are women in their 30s and 20s, 30s and 40s. Often they never come back to the same sector. The point was made earlier about us being in full employment, but that doesn't mean that we have the right composition of employment. It doesn't mean that they're working in the right sectors, and we will need to continuously, it's to Fergal's point about productivity and retraining, upskilling, we do need to continuously shift towards higher value added sectors. Now, construction isn't a particularly higher value added sector, but we will need more people in those sectors, which means arguably less, either increasing the participation rates, which means removing barriers related to childcare, disability, issues around working from home, flexibility, bringing people back to Ireland, which is a housing issue. But also dealing with the digital skills type issues as well, which allows us to move towards higher value added. So we can affect the composition of employment over the medium to long term through proper policy measures. So we can do that. So it's not that there's like a rump of 2.5 million people who work. So there are winners and losers. In terms of your question as to at what point are we not willing to help people? I mean, it's tapered, right? It's about degree. People on fixed incomes at the bottom, they're probably most in danger. So that's why we emphasise that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't scope for dealing with cost of living issues to do with childcare, education, healthcare, and so forth. For lower to middle groups, also things like working family payment can be improved for lower income workers. And yes, there is scope for increasing USC thresholds, tax credits, even the standard rate cutoff point, perhaps not fully indexed, but partially. So there is scope in those areas to help those groups, albeit to a lesser amount than those that are really, really in trouble as the winter kicks in.
Thank you. Are you finished, Deputy Boyd Barrett? Yep.
Unless you're giving me more
Well,
time.
we'll come round for a second round. I'm sure you have more questions. Deputy Ryan.